The use of the Signal app by senior leaders in the Trump administration has garnered plenty of attention. But was it illegal? One group suing the government says yes. Here to explain why is the executive director of American Oversight, Chioma Chukwu. Chioma, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Your organization has filed a lawsuit against several agencies and individuals in the Trump administration challenging their use of Signal and Google Docs. What is the basis for the suit? Let's start there.
Sure. Well, look, this isn't rocket science. Every federal employee should know that they can't delete government records. And that's why we are so concerned, and we filed a lawsuit. What we've learned is that what is happening across the administration with respect to using ephemeral messaging apps that are set to auto-delete is not just a policy failure. It's a deliberate effort by senior officials in this administration, across the administration, to erase history of what they're doing, why they're doing it, when they're doing it. That's information that belongs to the American people and information that federal workers have a duty to preserve. And it's not just dangerous for our democracy. It's also, in this case, a risk to our servicemen and women in uniform.
If these messaging apps and other tools have already deleted records of conversations and decisions, what happens now? Are they recoverable at some point?
Well, that's part of what our lawsuit is trying to get to. We want to know what steps have been taken to recover records that have been deleted. In some cases, that information can be retrieved. In other cases, they cannot. So the questions that we have for the Trump administration is, one, why were they deleting government records when they should know that under the Federal Records Act, they're not supposed to do that? They're supposed to preserve those records. And to the extent that records have in fact been deleted, we are asking that those records be retrieved to the extent they can be. Because again, those records belong to the government, they belong to the American people, and they should be preserved for history.
What is the status of the legal proceeding?
Well, we are still very much litigating against the Trump administration because of their failure to take what we believe are adequate efforts to preserve the records at issue. And because we have since learned that this problem is happening across the administration, we suspect across different agencies outside of those that were named in Signalgate, we are very much asking that all of the government agencies take steps in order to preserve records. And to the extent they're using Signal, that they are copying and that they are forwarding that information so that that information is living in the agencies as it's supposed to under the Federal Records Act. So we're going to be in court this Friday. We have an emergency motion asking the court to ensure that the records at issue are no longer destroyed. We want the court to prevent the further destruction of records and order the government to take actions, like I mentioned, to recover any records that have in fact been deleted.
Well, normally the National Archives and Records Administration is the agency that maintains the official records, but their senior leaders have all been removed, and the Secretary of State is the acting archivist. So what do you make of that situation? It seems that there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there.
That's exactly right. It should be concerning to anyone. Secretary Rubio was one of the individuals who was in one of these Signal threads that led to our original lawsuit. And him serving as the acting archivist, as you mentioned, who has a duty that when records are being destroyed, that he should ensure that the agencies are taking proper measures to recover those records. And if not, he's supposed to initiate an action with the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. So we've seen here a lack of interest from Secretary Rubio to act in his capacity as the acting archivist to ensure that those records are recovered and to work with the AG to make sure that those who have in fact deleted records are held accountable. We are very, very concerned.
The initial stories of the use of the Signal app came out about national security and DOD, but you mentioned this is happening across other agencies. Can you give us a couple of examples?
Well, one thing that recently became public was the former National Security Advisor's use of a plugin called Telemessage, which purports to be something that is used to archive Signal messages. And what we've learned since the reporting became public, that telemessage, this archiving application, one, it's not secure. It was hacked within a matter of minutes by an outside hacker, and it is now has been identified by the top government security agency as a very vulnerable application that should not be used in its current form. But also what we learned is that CPB, they also are using this application to conduct regular government business. And so it's just a snapshot of what we suspect may be happening across the government. And so what our lawsuit serves to do is to give us a better understanding of how widely is Signal being used across the administration. And to the extent that it is being used, what are the mechanisms that they have in place to preserve government records? Again, records that would reflect the government business that they are conducting day to day. And to the extent they're using insecure applications like telemessage, we have even greater concerns about how they're trying to preserve those records.
I'm speaking with Chioma Chukwu. She is the executive director of American Oversight. So let's talk more about those apps. We mentioned Signal, Google Docs, telemessage. What is it about the apps or the programs themselves that makes them suspect?
Well, they're not secure, meaning they haven't been held to the standard of the federal government that would ensure that sensitive information is not vulnerable to attacks by hackers, by foreign adversaries. And so we don't know how the government came into using telemessage, which is information that we certainly think the American people deserve to know. What we know is that each agency has a responsibility to ensure that they are complying with record-keeping practices that will ensure that our information remains safe, that classified information is not taken out of classified systems and communicated in these ephemeral messaging apps. All of these things, again, are very concerning. And the fact that telemessage is something that we just learned was hacked within minutes is something that continues to cause us incredible concern here.
There used to be people in every agency whose responsibility was to keep the records exactly for these purposes. Do you have a sense of whether those folks are still in the federal workforce? Are they the folks that have had early retirements or deferred retirements foisted upon them?
You know, this is a question that American Oversight is trying to get to the bottom of. What we have seen across the administration is the purging of FOIA officers and others who are responsible for federal records management. We don't know how many of these individuals still are employed and are working and ensuring that the agencies are complying with their record-keeping obligations. What we know is that it has become increasingly harder to get information about how the government is operating. What we know is that we are seeing that these agencies are deleting government records. And what we know is that there is a cavalier attitude toward transparency and adhering to the requirements that govern all federal agencies, that all federal workers are required to adhere to. And if they do not, they would be held to a different standard. And so we are trying to understand how many of these employees are left so that we can ensure that federal record keeping requirements are taken seriously.
So for the people whose day job wasn't federal record keeping, but they're still actively involved, what do you want them to know about the proper way to maintain records of decisions and conversations so that they don't further violate the Federal Records Act?
Well, what we want them to know is that every agency has guidance that they give about how to comply with federal record keeping in that particular agency. That guidance can vary. So as long as they are adhering to the requirements that have been promulgated by that particular agency, which is to preserve records that are created in the course of their day-to-day work, they should be doing the right thing. What we don't want and what we are concerned about is the increased use of applications to evade record keeping laws, to evade oversight, information that could be deleted from history. And so as long as federal employees are doing what they are required to do by preserving those records consistent with the advice that is given by the particular agency, they should be doing just the right thing.
Chioma Chukwu, thank you so much for bringing this issue to our attention and reminding everybody that records retention is part of our responsibility. And thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Chioma Chukwu is the Executive Director of American Oversight. We'll post this interview to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.